Hello, 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 hello. This is literally take two. I recorded the entire podcast earlier and did not have any sound. So hopefully I can be heard now. Uh, can I get a thumbs up if I can be heard? So this week we're going to talk about something that is really, really important to me, and that is following the money, corporate profits over community costs. So basically, how is it that the community ends up paying for things that corporations are doing? And I gotta say, I've this whole series, the Beyond the Divide series, has been fun, but this is the education portion, so it tends to be a little bit more serious, and uh, and so I know I've taken a very serious take these last 9 episodes or 8 episodes, but that is because this is some very important stuff to learn. And if we know how the systems work, then we can do better. We can make sure that we avert, the problems that we typically run into from those systems and the impact of those systems. And it helps us to be able to overcome challenges from that. So I let that down so you can see my shirt. Tonight I'm in a good mood, and I'm in a good mood. Last episode of the Beyond the Divide series, the educational series, and next week we're going to really go into the raw conversation where we have friends who come together and have conversations around the things that are impacting them, how they are impacted. You may hear a few F bombs dropped here and there, but we're all adults, and sometimes a little discomfort is just what we need in order to be able to talk our way through some of the challenges that we may have getting along with others, and learning how to have a good conversation and being real with each other, and at the same time being respectful of each other and learning to understand each other better. So let's get right to it. So this is Following the Money, Corporate Profits and Community Costs. I am Jay Jones, the host of the Cut podcast, and today we're going to examine the relationship between corporate profits and community costs, how business decisions that boost financial returns often impose expenses that don't appear on corporate balance sheets but are very real for communities. Things like football stadiums, proposed football stadiums where the billionaires who own the football teams are going to make a total profit. However, the property tax increases of the people who live in the city are the things that they don't talk about that's helping to pay for that stadium. So, and many people don't even go to football games, but yet they want to impose that on the community. So those are just some of the things that we're going to talk about. So the past 4 decades have seen record corporate profits alongside stagnant wages for most workers and growing economic insecurity in many communities. These trends aren't random, but reflect specific decisions about how businesses operate and who bears the cost of those operations. So today we'll track specific examples of how corporate decisions impact local communities, compare CEO compensation to worker wages across industries, and examine the role of shareholder primacy in driving these patterns. So this conversation isn't anti-business, but it's about ensuring that business operates in ways that genuinely benefit society rather than enriching a few at the expense of the many. So when I talked about the business operations and how businesses are now tending to uh, transfer their operational costs to the consumer. It brings me to think about when I go to restaurants now and you see these service charges and you see credit card charges, and you know having a credit card machine and paying the percentage to the credit card companies is just a matter of business operation, and it's not something that should be transferred to the consumer. So I've gone to restaurants where I literally called out, the business itself because I saw like a 3.5%, charge, service charge. And then, it's when I ask, is this the tip? And it's not the tip. Well, why are you charging me a 3.5% service charge? if it's not part of the tip. So that's something that I think that the service attendant and the business owner must have a conversation about, because literally, if that is the case and they don't remove it, then I'm going to make my 3.5%. I'm going to take it away from the 15% that I would have been tipping and make it an 11.5%. So sometimes someone's gonna get the the urge to bring it up and to complain about that, if they want to be fair, because I don't think it's fair as a consumer to have to soak up the charge for someone to run their business. The other thing is when you see a credit card charge, I'm like, are you serious? To be able to use a credit card versus cash. So they want to charge you to be able to use your credit card, when again, it's an operational charge, an operational expense. So businesses write that off when they file for their taxes. They write that off as an operational expense. So why am I paying it as a consumer, so that they get that as profit rather than being able to, you know, um, have that expense as they should? All right. So again, these aren't just anti-business. This isn't an anti-business conversation. It's about just making sure that I point out the things that you have a right as a consumer to make sure that you call out with these businesses. And many times they will remove those charges if you let them know just what I just told you. You know, it's an operational expense that's tax deductible, and in a sense, it's kind of tax fraud if they're charging consumers to pay for it and then filing it on their taxes as an operating expense. Um, so the divergence between profits and prosperity. Let's talk about that. So let's begin by examining a puzzling trend. Corporate profits have soared to record levels while most Americans have seen limited economic gains. Corporate profits as a percentage of the gross domestic product, and a lot of organizations don't want to have unions, and that's probably why, because they plan to pay their shareholders but not their employees. And unions would represent better wages for those employees. So now we're going to talk about CEO compensation. So CEO compensation illustrates this divergence dramatically. In 1965, for instance, CEOs at major companies earned about 20 times that of the average worker's pay. Today, that ratio exceeds 300 to 1 at many of the large companies. These increases have far outpaced both inflation and company performance measures. So, one word: greed. This is corporate greed at its finest. So, so these increases have outpaced both inflation and company performance. Meanwhile, studies by economists like Emmanuel Saez and Gabriel Zuckman show that wealth concentration has returned to levels not seen since the 1920s. The top 1% of Americans now hold more wealth than the bottom 90% combined. Those large scale companies are paying, or those employees from those companies are paying civic organizations that weaken as population declines. And the churches and civic organizations, when they weaken, there are a lot of services that they provide for the community that go away. So in Lordstown, Ohio, the closure of the GM assembly plant eliminated 4,500 direct jobs and an estimated 8,000 additional jobs in the community. While GM's financial statements showed improved profitability, the community experienced declining property values, school funding challenges, and increased demand for social services. So let's talk about that for a second. We said 4,500 direct jobs and 8,000 additional jobs in the community. So you say, how does that happen? Well, if there were 4,500 people who were making good money in this community and they lost their jobs, then likely in order for them to find another job that paid even close to what they were making, they had to move or go somewhere, leave the community. So when they leave the community, just think about all those small businesses that were really relying on that group of people, to come into their businesses to buy sandwiches during lunch, or to, come to their coffee shop and buy coffee on their way to work. And now that they're not on their way to work anymore, that coffee shop doesn't get passed up as much, or doesn't get passed by as much. And now it doesn't have as much foot traffic, so they're not making as much money. When you think about that, and that's an additional 8,000 jobs, which is almost twice as much as the number of people who actually lost their jobs at the plant. Then you got to talk about property values declining because there's no commerce there, there's no jobs there. Then you talk about school funding because the taxes from the money that the employees would have made, the taxes that they're paying into the municipality would have helped the schools. And then also social services. So there's just this domino effect in terms of when things get bad, they get worse. And that's how these corporations are impacting these communities. Then, so let's talk about environmental externalities. So when corporations externalize environmental costs, they improve their financial performance by shifting costs to communities. So pollution creates healthcare costs borne by residents and public health systems. Resource extraction without adequate remediation leaves communities with long-term environmental damage. And then we talk about greenhouse gas emission, which create climate costs distributed globally, but felt most acutely by vulnerable communities. I think the Aaron Brockovich case, the movie Aaron Brockovich, was one of those that talked about the negative impact of. Then you think about systems and industries, and they're talking about the coal industry, for instance. The studies estimate that the coal industry would be unprofitable if it had to account for all the full health and environmental costs of its operations. In other words, if the coal industry was was responsible to pay for all the people who have black lung as a result of working down in the mines, then they'd go broke. So instead, these costs are effectively subsidized by communities experiencing health impacts and environmental degradation. So in other words, they have a tax. They create a tax for everything. So in those coal mining communities, not only are they getting black lung by working in those coal mines, they're also paying additional taxes to help pay for the black lung that they're getting, rather than those companies that are causing them to get black lung paying for it. So it's really kind of a really bad system when you think of things that way. The other thing is that when you talk about industries in general, and you talk about a capitalist society, industries are there in order to hold up the economy. So when we talk about industry, you got to look at the healthcare industry, for instance. The healthcare industry is the biggest shyster, especially on Black people. So you get rid of slavery with the Emancipation Proclamation, but you got to have slavery somewhere, because the capitalist society requires slavery or some form of enslavement to be successful. So if you've never heard that, you heard it here. A capitalist society requires some type of enslavement to be a successful economy. Let me give you an example. When we have food deserts in Black and brown communities, that's on purpose. You have to feed the industries, the insurance industry, the healthcare industry, you know, the oil and gas industry. When you look at it and you're talking about the transportation industry, even, you know, the housing industry, the market, all these things, it's one big, plan. When you talk about redlining, the houses in certain zip codes aren't going to be worth as much as houses in other zip codes just because of who lives there. Then, when you talk about, though, these food deserts in Black and brown communities, you have to understand the quality of food is bad. Everything is processed. When you think about the woman who held the McDonald's food in her closet for 24 years and it was still intact, isn't that just kind of sickening? Um, yeah, I see someone put the school to prison pipeline on there. That's exactly right. The free labor of the inmates, all of those things are exactly what I'm talking about. The industries, and there's a prison industry. we have we literally have a prison industry right now, and the fact that Congress members are buying stock in it tells you that even the way our laws and our governance is being created is to make sure that people fill those prisons, and that's what that pipeline is for. And it's just unfortunate that the majority of people who do that would be the folks who are less fortunate, which are the same folks who have these food deserts, which is the same folks who will have the healthcare issues and feed so that the healthcare industry can thrive. the same people who have those issues so that the pharmaceutical industry can thrive. If you eat unhealthy food, which McDonald's and Burger King and Wendy's and all these companies have, then you're more likely to go on blood pressure medicines and cholesterol medicines. And, those are the medicines that cost most, by the way. So the poorest people need the most expensive drugs. Go figure. You know, for about 8 years in the 2000s, I worked for a pharmaceutical company. I won't mention their names, but I worked in the respiratory market. So I literally went out and I talked to physicians and shared with them information on clinical data about a certain drug that we had, which was a respiratory drug. So this drug was a drug that was very mild in nature, but it was a different pathway than others. So it was very safe. It didn't cross the blood-brain barrier, and it was safe enough for children, even very, very young children. Then they learned that it worked for something else. So then it was an asthma drug that started to work for allergies. So the market got expanded. The drug was only, expected to make a few $1 million and ended up making $4 billion. And so with that being said, we were talking to doctors and we were telling them, look, this drug is very safe, it's effective, and it may be a way for you to keep your patients off steroids. We know the negative impacts of steroids. People gain weight off steroids. The large population of patients who are taking these drugs are, minorities or ethnic minorities, so to speak, but not necessarily minorities, because ethnic minorities globally are the majority. And then, it causes all other kinds of problems. So let's not do that. Let's try this drug first to see if we can thwart off the condition getting more severe, in which case you won't have to use steroids to protect these patients. Well, what happened is doctors were using it and using it a lot. The very companies, so they they went and acquired another company that was mainly a steroid focused. So for me, after 8 years of telling doctors, steroids are not good. They're not good for a patient. There was just no way I was going to go. So once I decided, I looked in and recognized that the company's pipeline had an obesity drug in it. So now it made sense, Now it made sense. Buy a steroid company. Now you're going to start feeding patients steroids, asking your doctors to give patients steroids to get them fat. Then you're going to sell them an obesity drug to help them lose the weight. But at the same time, once they get fat, they're going to have heart problems, diabetes problems, asthma problems. So they're using all of your drugs rather than just one, which is the cheapest one. So this is kind of how these things roll. This is that cyclical problem we have when we're talking about, healthcare disparities and how one industry feeds into the other industry. Not to mention now the insurance companies, healthcare disparities, and how one industry feeds into the other industry. Not to mention now the insurance companies are and greater risk for health issues because of the food desert that you live in, since you can't get healthy foods. So it's so many things that come into play that we have to consider when we're talking about these corporate decisions that impact our communities. So in case you hadn't considered that, that's just something for you to think about. Well, and so today, and again, that corporate consolidation often boosts profits through increased market power, but imposes various community costs. So you got to understand too now, your small businesses that are often created to try and help people with a problem. You usually have like vegan restaurants, things like that, where people are trying to help people get away from the unhealthy things and do the healthy things. Those businesses struggle to compete with larger corporations, and so you'll have another company like some major grocery chain or whatever that'll come in with these food that they label vegan foods, just to make sure that this small vegan grocery store doesn't survive. And then once that small vegan grocery store goes away, the large corporation eventually kind of weeds out the things that they had to offer, which again puts you back in the same situation. And then, so that bargaining power is no longer there. Pharmacists, for instance, back in 1998, when I was finishing school, the you know mom and pop pharmacies were going away because they couldn't compete with your Walgreens, your CVS's, your Rite Aids, because they just based on volume could offer lower prices. And then too, of course, the larger insurance companies were willing to work with those organizations more so than they were with the smaller mom and pop organizations. So again, we have to understand that this system, this capitalist market that we have, is not designed for the average American. It's designed for shareholders. This whole trickle down economy bullshit that Ronald Reagan came up with is not good for any of us. It's only good for that top 1%, which again has more wealth than the bottom 90% combined. And so we just gotta, the more awareness that we have, the more things we know, the more we learn, the better able we are to make informed decisions about our own bodies. Plant your garden, don't eat the processed foods, things like that. Right now, I wouldn't trust these folks with anything. So I don't trust them with anything, being dependent upon a government that doesn't give a shit about you. So I'm going to end it here. And again, next week we leave education series and we go into the real conversations. So you might hear a few F-bombs, a few F-bombs dropped, because people are really hurting and people are really in survival mode. We should all be thriving, but people are in this survival mode. The reason why we create podcasts like this is just to, bring about some awareness to people, because we cannot count on mainstream media for you to learn anything that's going to help you. It's all about what's going to benefit the wealthy, what's going to profit the shareholders, and that's it. Everything that you hear is basically a narrative that is created by the wealthy for the wealthy. So this is where you get your information. It's from podcasts like this, and I hope that you'll listen in. Follow me on Instagram, follow me on Facebook, follow me on LinkedIn. All of my social media pages, though, can be found on my website, which is thekut.com. That is THEKUTT.com, thekut.com. And for those of you who don't know what the cut is a position that you never want to find yourself in. It's kind of there's kind of an inside story that I won't share here with you right now, but so when I created this podcast and I called it The Cut, it's how can I help us get out of this position that we never wanted to be in the first place. And I think awareness, education, awareness, conversations around these things, getting to know each other better, understanding that we have way more in common than we have that divides us, is really, really important, especially at this time. So I sign off tonight by saying, thank you again for tuning in. I hope that you'll definitely tune in going forward, because it's about to get real. And I look forward to seeing you next time. So again, follow me, Jay Jones Conversations on Instagram, Jay Jones Conversations on LinkedIn, Jay Jones Easy Conversations on Facebook. So I look forward to seeing you. Take care and have a good week. Enjoy your Memorial Day. Thank you. Bye.